I'm delighted to welcome you to Whose Freedom, Whose Speech? The Future of Community and Free Speech at the University of Virginia. Tonight's panel discussion brings together a group of civil rights advocates, cultural commentators, and legal experts to discuss how universities such as ours can advance equality and inclusion while protecting free speech. Many of you tonight will reconvene tomorrow for further discussion about complex questions related to identity, inclusion, and free expression. So I hope that the ideas and opinions you hear tonight will inspire and challenge you to carry on this important conversation. Events such as this one bring complexity and nuance to the ongoing debates about free speech, inclusion, and diversity that are happening on college campuses across the country. This type of community dialogue, based in reasoned discussion and mutual respect, is especially important after the events that occurred in Charlottesville last August. I want to thank our provost, Tom Katsoulias, and Susan Nossel, the CEO of PEN America, for collaborating to host these 2 days of community discussion. And most importantly, thanks to all of you for your participation. I would now like to introduce tonight's moderator, Roger Worthington. Roger is a national leader in diversity education. Currently the Chief Diversity Officer and Interim Associate Provost at the University of Maryland in College Park, Roger is also Professor and Chair of the Department of Counseling, Higher Education, and Special Education there. He is a recognized scholar and higher education consultant on issues of diversity in counseling and education. Mr. Worthington was a founding member of the Board of Directors for the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. He's the recipient of 3 prestigious grants from the Ford Foundation Difficult Dialogues Initiative, and he's the current editor of the Journal of Diversity in Higher Education, and the winner of numerous awards for academic service and teaching excellence. Please welcome Roger Worthington.
Thank you, President Sullivan, for your introduction. And tonight, we have a great program for you, as you see, the title, Whose Freedom, Whose Speech, presented to you by PEN America and the University of Virginia. I have the great pleasure of serving as a moderator tonight, which was actually a bit of a change at the last minute because one of our panelists scheduled for the program, Laura Murphy, fell ill and was unable to be here. So Suzanne Nossel, who was arranged to be the moderator, will now serve as a panelist. So let me introduce our panelists, beginning with Suzanne Nossel, who, since joining PEN America in 2013, has overseen a doubling of the organization's staff and budget. She is a leading voice on free expression issues in the US and globally, writing and being interviewed frequently for national and international media outlets. Her prior career spanned government service and leadership roles in the corporate and nonprofit sectors. She has served as the Chief Operating Officer of Human Rights Watch and as Executive Director of Amnesty International USA. During the first term of the Obama administration, Nossel served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations, where she led US engagement in the United Nations and multilateral institutions on human rights and humanitarian issues. During the Clinton administration, Nossel was deputy to the US Ambassador for UN Management and Reform at the US Mission to the United Nations. All right, and next I will introduce to you a student here at UVA, Alexis Gravely. Is a third-year student at UVA studying media studies and elementary education. She has been part of the Cavalier Daily since her first year and now serves as the newspaper's assistant managing editor. Her most notable work includes her coverage of the August 11th and 12th white supremacist rallies in Charlottesville. Additionally, she is part of the highly competitive Black on Campus program, which allows emerging Black journalists to sharpen their professional skills while documenting the experiences of Black college students. Jelani Cobb is director of the Ira A. Lipman Center for Journalism and Civil and Human Rights and Columbia University's Ira A. Lipman Professor of Journalism. He joined the faculty in 2016. He's contributed to The New Yorker since 2012 and became a staff writer in 2015. Dr. Cobb is the recipient of the 2015 Sidney Hillman Award for Opinion and Analysis Writing and writes frequently about race, politics, history, and culture. He's the author of The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress. To the Break of Dawn, a freestyle of the hip-hop aesthetic, and The Devil and Dave, The Devil and Dave Chappelle and other essays. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, the New Republic, Essence, Vibe, and The Progressive, and TheRoot.com. Leslie Kendrick, Vice Dean and Professor of Law at University of Virginia School of Law, is an expert in the First Amendment and freedom of expression, particularly the scope and structure of free speech rights. She writes and teaches courses in torts, property, and constitutional law. Before joining the faculty in 2008, Kendrick clerked for Judge J. Harvey Wilkinson III of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit and Justice David Hackett Souter of the Supreme Court of the United States. She has been a visiting professor at UCLA Law School and Harvard Law School as well. Please join me in welcoming our panelists tonight. Our conversation tonight is to really explore some of the most challenging issues on college and university campuses in today's world: diversity, inclusion, and free speech. The PEN America group has been on a number of campuses over the course of the last several months, helping universities across the country to explore issues of free speech and diversity and inclusion, including Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, Middlebury College, and my own campus, the University of Maryland, College Park, before coming here to visit the University of Virginia. So I'd like to start with a question to Suzanne Nossel about what kinds of issues are being surfaced in the course of this nationwide university tour, and what do you think are some of the most challenging and pernicious issues that we're really facing today in higher education?
Thanks, yeah. So we began our work on campus free speech with a report that we put out at the end of 2016, where we looked at some of the most entrenched, intense controversies that had happened around the country. At the time, it was the events at the University of Missouri and at Yale and at UCLA. And our effort there was to explore the tension between the imperative to make the campus a more diverse, inclusive, and equal environment, and then on the other side at times, the commitment to robust and uncompromising protections for freedom of speech and academic freedom. So we wanted to look at things like disinvitations to campus speakers, punishments for speech, disciplining of faculty and students for acts of speech, safe spaces, microaggressions, trigger warnings. And in our report, we really try to look at both sides of each of those issues and weigh the arguments and kind of give the arguments really their due and we set out a set of principles called the PEN Principles on Campus Speech, which were an effort to explain how these sometimes competing principles could be, in our view, reconciled, and the imperative of driving forward an agenda for greater equality and inclusion on campus, but doing so in a way that wouldn't compromise protections for free speech and academic freedom. And so we've gone to some of the sites of the most intense controversies, and each one looks honestly a little bit different. The first convening we did was at the University of California at Berkeley. It's a huge community and school. It's quite left-leaning. It's very, very diverse. And in fact, there, we had conservative students who were saying they really feel it on the outside, on campus. It's difficult for them to book rooms for their events. They can't get academic departments to co-sponsor events with them. And that this drove some of the frustration and sense of isolation that led some of them to think of something like what they called this Free Speech Week, where they invited Ann Coulter and Milo Yiannopoulos and a lot of very provocative right-leaning speakers whose presence on campus or potential presence on campus was seen as menacing by other students and as threatening and necessitated heavy expenditures in terms of security. But we got to some of the underlying issues behind that. And it was interesting. Even some of the students of color actually validated this sense of conservative students of their isolation and kind of marginalization on campus. At Middlebury, very different, completely different environment. It's a small, sequestered school in Vermont, the whitest state in the union, African-American student population of just about 4%. And there, when Charles Murray came to campus, it provoked protests that turned violent, people were injured, and the campus has had difficulty despite, I think, really genuine efforts in coming to grips with it. It was almost as if in this very small, tightly knit community, almost like, it felt like a congregation almost in terms of how well people knew each other and how close they are, that something really explosive happened. And a sense that for students of color there, they'd never felt entirely comfortable, despite the efforts of the university, maybe partly because of the environment in Vermont and how homogenous it is, and that sense of kind of overarching discomfort made the presence of someone like Charles Murray with his controversial ideas almost too much to bear and sparked these really intense protests and reaction. At Maryland, I think it also centers on issues of race, and I think that's one overarching theme I would say is how intertwined questions of the racial justice and speech have become, and that what many of the students who are sort of accused of being intolerant toward free speech or seeking to shut down speech, that's not the crux of their agenda. Often the crux of their agenda is more around racial diversity and inclusion, and the concerns that have intensified over the last 15 or 16 months since the election with a spike in white supremacist activity on campus. So that's their driving concern, and at times it may spill over into a call to silence or punish speech, but when you enter into dialogue, that's not the ultimate motivation.
Leslie, as a First Amendment lawyer, can you give us a bit of background on what the Constitution and our law says about free speech on campus? Is there any speech that is out of bounds at a public university?
Sure. So thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I can talk about this briefly because I want to get to the point where we're hearing questions from you all. So I'd emphasize two points here. One is the rules for public universities and private universities look very different. Public universities are instruments of the state. They're what are called state actors under First Amendment, under American law, and that means that the policies of public universities and the actions of employees of public universities can implicate the First Amendment, whereas the policies of or actions of employees of private universities don't. This is something that, although it's a very fundamental principle, bears repeating because often people make mistakes about it in public dialogue. So let's say someone's fired from ESPN and people say that person's First Amendment rights were infringed because they were fired by ESPN. That's not correct. ESPN is a private entity. Its actions don't implicate the First Amendment. They might implicate free speech values that we would want to endorse as a society, but they don't implicate the First Amendment. Similarly, private universities, their actions don't implicate the First Amendment. Public universities' actions do. That means that public universities have certain legal obligations that are incumbent upon them, and that includes some obligations under the First Amendment. So what do those obligations look like? here's the sort of second part of it. So universities are a particular type of state actor. And an interesting thing about universities is we are places where speech is regulated all the time in certain types of ways. You students out there in the audience, you take exams. You have to take the exam. You could not come in and say, it's against my First Amendment rights to make me take this exam. I tell my First Amendment students, if you give that answer to your test, you're getting a 0. You're getting an F in the First Amendment class because you haven't learned the scope of the First Amendment. So in terms of what we're doing at a university, it's about speech, and it's about speech that's regulated in all sorts of ways all the time. We're asking people to learn material, to apply the material. We grade people based on the quality of their analysis. Universities tenure people or don't tenure people, hire people or don't hire people based on the quality of their ideas. But that's all happening within a certain intellectual space. That is about a certain type of intellectual inquiry. And there are certain ways in which universities can't regulate speech. Public universities can't regulate speech. So for example, you can't regulate someone's speech based on their political affiliation or their political ideology. That was one of the issues in the McCarthy era where there were questions about, or tests given to, sort of test act questions given to professors. If you're a communist, you can't teach at a university, you can't teach at a public school. Partly through mistakes, like the McCarthy era, we've come to the conclusion that there are certain types of speech regulation that don't have any place at the university. And those largely are about things that seem extrinsic to the intellectual endeavor that we're trying to engage in. So political ideology, for the most part, certain types of political beliefs, political statements. And that means that for students, and to some extent for faculty, the rules are more complicated for faculty and staff, you enjoy a high degree of autonomy in terms of the ideas you can espouse, the ideas you can interrogate, question, experiment with when you're at a university. I think the difficult thing comes in, what are the boundaries on that? And it turns out that under First Amendment law, a lot of speech is protected. There's not an unprotected category of hate speech under First Amendment law. There's instead certain well-defined pockets of speech that are not protected. Incitement, there's a particular definition for incitement. Defamation, there's a particular definition for that. True threats, there are particular definitions for that. Conduct that has speech accompanying it, conduct can also be regulated. So vandalism, for example, can be regulated. And at public universities, there are also assurances through the Civil Rights Act to ensure that everyone has an opportunity for a free and equal education that's not impinged upon by conduct that rises to a level of a hostile environment that denies them an ability to obtain an education. So there are offices of civil rights that are designed to try to police that boundary and to ensure that people have the education that they're entitled to. So I think I've talked too much.
Good.
I'll stop now.
Let's explore that a little bit, though. Jelani, some people argue that by suppressing or punishing hateful speech, you risk pushing hateful feelings underground, where they might become more dangerous. Or others maintain that having hate speech out in the open can give inspiration for hateful acts. Do you think that there's a relationship between hateful speech and hateful actions?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I don't think that's controversial, but we're talking about the issue of incitement. And so one of the great benefits of the First Amendment is the protection of art and artistic expression. And artistic expression is supposed to shape our values in particular ways and ultimately inspire us to behave or in one way or not behave in a different way. So there's very clearly a relationship between these two things. That relationship is not one-to-one. It's not like someone tells us, stop smoking, and we all run out and stop smoking, or someone tells us to start smoking, and we do. And so The question is, at what point do we rise to, I guess, the conundrum of the ways in which democratic principles can be deployed to anti-democratic ends? And I think that what happened here in August was the classic example of this. Now, anyone who's familiar with the history of this country, or specifically familiar with the history of race in this country, is not mystified by what happened in August. Nor would they be mystified that by the fact that what happened occurred under the rubric of free speech. If we look back about 100 years ago, one of the first instances in which this paradox between social justice and free speech emerged was the release of the film Birth of a Nation. A nascent organization, all of us, I assume, are familiar with that film, the D.W. Griffith's racist classic epic, which is the cornerstone of American cinema. And a nascent organization called the NAACP took issue with the showings of this film, as did other African-American civil rights advocates. And one part of the NAACP was kind of fractured the organization. One part of it said that this film has to be defended on free speech grounds. The other part of it said this film is directly implicated in people running out and lynching us. And so there was no hypothetical relationship between Birth of a Nation and the actions of the Ku Klux Klan. There was a forensic relationship. You could see the connection between these two things in that the ritual of the burning of the cross, that was not part of the Klan's original iconography in their rituals. That was a cinematic device that D.W. Griffith conjured because he wanted a way to depict to his audiences the burning passion for racial superiority that these individuals displayed. And so this became an instance of life imitating art quite literally. And so people like W.B. Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter were saying, fine, well, and good, you were talking about the protection of free speech as a fundamental cornerstone of democracy, but we're also telling you that what you're saying, because we don't all have the same relationship to the Constitution, that in a hierarchical society, the elements of democracy can be used in ways that reinforce those hierarchies. And this is what we saw in August, this is what we saw in 1915, this is what we've seen in many other instances that we're talking to. And so these two things are in tension. Now, what I would take issue with is that in these pockets of speech that we recognize as subject to regulation, we say that incitement is not protected. We say that defamation is not protected. But I'm calling into question the accuracy and the truthfulness and really the honesty of claims saying that if we are saying we do not invite people to advocate discredited ideas, that we are somehow or another making this a less democratic society. Germany doesn't believe that prohibiting people from denying the Holocaust makes them less of a democracy, right. Nor does France. Right. But in the United States, we feel like if we impair your ability to act in racist ways, and given that race in America has been the fundamental contradiction in democracy, the biggest claim that we have to the United States not being a democracy is its history on race. And if we prohibit the furtherance of those ideas, we're making ourselves less of a democracy. That's contradictory. That doesn't add up.
So drawing a connection between a film and incitement. Leslie, should Birth of a Nation have been banned?
So I want to step back and make a distinction that might help with the conversation. I think we should distinguish between descriptively what the law is in the United States and normatively what we think what it ought to be. I think that's important in the context of something like a university that has an obligation to follow the law as it exists. That's a different thing from asking what the law should be like. So Jelani just raised the point about Germany and France. From a normative perspective, I think it's important to think about the fact that the United States has by far the most speech protective regime in the world. Where we draw these lines and which pockets are protected and which pockets are not protected, that looks very different here from what it does in any other country, including other Western democracies. So it is what it is here on a descriptive level to some extent. And those tasked with being state actors have to take that into account. But I think we can ask a normative question as well about what we think it ought to look like. And Jelani raises one of the key justifications that is often given, and I think within this context is one of the soundest justifications for why we have the speech law that we do, which is it's necessary from the standpoint of democratic legitimacy. That if you don't allow all viewpoints into the decision making on the front end, on the inputs, you don't wind up with legitimate outputs. And our nation went through a struggle with this in another context of anti-democratic speech in the 20s and 30s with socialists, and then later in the 50s with communists. And there the fundamental question was, what should a democracy do with anti-democratic speech? What should a liberal polity do with illiberal speech? And that structure is very similar to the structure that we see when we're thinking about what does a democracy that's founded on the equality of all individuals do with speech that rejects that very proposition? I think this is the hardest question that free speech has to answer, that the idea of free speech has to answer. And our country has erred on the side of we're going to try to protect inputs. But other countries have decided, you know what, there's some inputs we can do without. But a second point to make is that those countries have done that through a democratic process. I think it's very easy for people to think, well, if there were speech regulation, it would look like what I want it to look like. But that speech regulation, the alternative to something like the First Amendment, the alternative that democracies use is democratic decision making. So you have to ask yourself, what types of speech regulations would we have, and do we trust our government to generate those regulations? And there have been very many times when in our history where our country has failed in that regard, in banning abolitionist pamphlets in the run-up to the Civil War, in the tactics of many states in the South to try to shut down coverage of the civil rights movement and to shut down civil rights protesters. So, you know, I think two important justifications to keep in mind are, what does democratic legitimacy require, and what types of regulation do we think we can actually achieve?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
When has white supremacy ever lacked for input in American history and policy?
I am not saying that it hasn't. I am not saying that it hasn't. And
So we're talking about a hypothetical threat that in an instance in which we have seen this country deformed consistently by the prevalence of these ideas. However, it's like we're like having a Second Amendment discussion again. Like, we have seen people mowed down. We've seen homicide rates that are an embarrassment to the Western world. But if we regulate our ability to have guns in even the most reasonable way, we somehow become less of a democracy. And so we're saying, hypothetically, theoretically, we become less democratic if we gave less input to people who've already had hegemonic power in America from the outset. You can understand why that argument is not convincing.
To be clear, I want to set out some components of these arguments, and normatively speaking, I'm not here to justify either of these justifications. I'm here to provide justifications that have been given that I think are better than many that have been that don't hold up. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they get us all the way to the ground. I think we do have to think critically about whether democratic legitimacy does actually require what the Supreme Court has suggested that it does. I'm not taking a position on that at all. I agree with you. France and Germany and other countries have decided they can be a democratically legitimate state without the same level of speech protections that we have, and that's an important perspective that's often missing from American free speech discussion.
Okay, so that's I'm going to give her the last word on that exchange for right now, and maybe we'll come back to it for a couple seconds later. But so now, Jelani has brought up the idea that, higher education is in the context of a new normal. We have white supremacists using the basis of their actions as the First Amendment and free speech. And students are crying out for change in this country and on their campuses. And so, Alexis, you've been a student here and you've covered the events of August 11th and 12th. Were your views on free speech changed by what you witnessed? And if so, how so?
I wouldn't say that they changed necessarily. I would say that they became more clear to me, and what I already thought was kind of confirmed. I guess we'll talk a little bit about this later, but you see the media calling college student snowflakes for not tolerating this hateful speech. But until you're here and you see people marching around where you go to school with torches and openly chanting, "Jew will not replace us," targeting specific groups, you can't really understand how threatening and how scary that is. And at the same time, you have students who were huddled around the statue of Thomas Jefferson, holding a sign and chanting "Black Lives Matter" peacefully, and they were pepper sprayed for that. And so then you see that there are some parts of speech that, frankly, I just don't think is free speech. It's hate speech, and it shouldn't be allowed. It's targeting a group. It's threatening. And then you see students who are peacefully protesting, and their speech is oppressed for it. They're harmed for it. And so I think that there might be a time and a place for speech, and maybe there isn't. I'm not really sure, but I just don't think that college campuses are the place for what we saw in August.
Good. So college campuses are under threat. People are saying, actually, college campuses are soft targets. White supremacists and others are identifying college campuses as a place where they can come and do their bidding on the basis of the First Amendment. And if their rights are infringed upon, then how are their interests served? Suzanne, do you have thoughts about that?
It poses a real challenge, and the threat is real. I mean, even back a couple of years ago when we wrote about the question of safe spaces, it was this notion, like you say, of sort of, students, were they asking to be protected from uncomfortable ideas, to be cloistered, for an intellectually kind of sterile environment where they would agree with everything, they wouldn't be challenged or confronted with, uncomfortable notions. And I think the question of safety has really changed in nature. I mean, we've now seen what happened here, the murder at the University of Maryland, which is now being prosecuted as a hate crime, and other incidents around the country that have turned violent. So safety, physical safety is an issue. And I think, what it comes down to, we do have in our law recognition that certain kinds of speech, threats and harassment, are not protected by the First Amendment, but how we how we define that. What is a hostile environment on campus? I mean, it's pretty hostile when you see what happened here in August. The hostile environment under the law really has to do with whether a university administration or an employer is failing to take steps to counter that kind of environment. And so, these developments, and they're numerically significant. There's been a tripling of white supremacist incidents on college campuses. The ADL, Anti-Defamation League, documented 173 separate incidents just in the fall semester of last year. So I think it does push us to look at, what can be done about this kind of behavior and action and menace that sometimes takes on, the guise of speech. They wrap themselves in the cloak of free speech, protections. And I think that's also a very worrisome dimension of this that we think about a lot, which is that for many students, the way that they're hearing about and encountering the First Amendment on campus is almost exclusively sort of through the lens of offensive speech. It's to protect speech that is targeting them, racial slurs, insults, denigration, and the recognition of the role of the free speech in the First Amendment historically, the things Leslie's talking about, First Amendment to protect protest rights, enabling the civil rights revolution, the advancement of women's rights, environmental rights, all these other issues that would not have progressed in the ways that they have without the protection for First Amendment rights of association and speech. It feels like all that's almost being lost in this current moment, and that these ideas have been appropriated by an agenda that is out to target students from minority and marginalized groups. So part of our goal and our work is to kind of reclaim this broader understanding of the First Amendment and the breadth of ideas that it protects. I don't think it's perfect, but I also recognize, when we talk about, the notion that we can make distinctions between what speech shouldn't be permitted, and that we can kind of draw a line around certain kinds of anti-democratic speech. I do worry about who's drawing that line, and how in particular political moments it's going to be rendered. Is it going to call ideas that are threatening to the institution of marriage out of bounds, or anti-democratic, or contrary to how our society should operate? And we've seen examples of that in this country, around the world. There are these intense debates. Holocaust denial is illegal in Europe, but they've had a raging debate about the so-called defamation of religion and anti-Muslim cartoons, and whether that speech also should be illegalized. And then if that's illegalized, what's next? And I think what they haven't really been able to do is articulate a neutral set of principles about the speech that should be excluded. And if you could assume that set of principles exists, so that you could draw a neat line around white supremacist speech, I think that would be one thing. But I don't think that's possible, and I don't think it's going to happen in this country. So that's why I'm a little bit skeptical that we could have a different set of rules that would work better.
So part of the question becomes, where do you draw any line if there is going to be one? And so, Leslie pointed out that there are differences between private companies and public institutions, between private institutions and public educational institutions. There's a difference between what the military is allowed to prohibit versus other branches of the government because of concerns about safety and their mission and role in the government. Are there nuances here? Do we have the ability to find and identify where public institutions of higher education can draw a line? Jelani, what's your thought on that?
So I think that, Suzanne and I know each other. We've had this conversation before. She knows I disagree with her about this.
I did too, that's why I asked you to go next.
But it's my job.
No, we're going to go have drinks and talk about this. You'll still be wrong, but we'll have we look at things that are difficult and say that they're arbitrary, but we have to find a line somewhere because we don't lapse into complete relativism around issues of human rights. We have a universal declaration of human rights. And we're able to say, of all the entire spectrum of human cultures and political systems of organization, these are 48 things that we think are fundamentally non-disputable. And so I don't think that it's impossible, and again, going back to the Second Amendment kind of argument, I don't think it's impossible to have a sensible gun regulation that also allows people to have the right to self-defense. And so I don't think that it's impossible for us to have a conversation about saying, what reinforces the hierarchy that has fundamentally deformed the United States since its inception? And what should our relationship to these things be? Now that's on the kind of who makes the rules kind of side of it. On the other side of it, like the frustration of having this conversation around race all the time is because race is this idea that can't be debunked because it serves this invaluable social function of justifying the hierarchies that continue to exist in the society. But we don't see biology departments inviting phrenologists or Lamarckian geneticists. We don't see economics departments inviting Malthusian economists. We have a set of ideas that we believe are discredited. Race does not correlate to anything that we know, yet every 20 minutes there's somebody who, in the name of free speech, has to bring somebody promulgating these discredited ideas about race. And we say that we're not democratic if we don't let this person promulgate these same discredited ideas. Finally, mindful that I'm at the University of Virginia, I have to say these are the kind of contradictions that come invariably, inevitably, when we have to turn, as our exemplar of free speech, to the same person who owns 607 black people. These contradictions are implicit, and this is the person whom we have to hold up. And what does that mean to a black person to say that we're supposed to admire and recognize the foundations of American democracy in the person of this individual who owned 607 black people and who opined in the notes on Virginia about the implicit and inherent inferiority of black people? That's where you get your fundamental questions in democracy. That's where you get these contradictions that we can't seem to reconcile or even muster the will to attempt to reconcile in a credible way.
So in part, you're identifying, invitations to folks to come to institutions of higher education. Let's see, are there ever situations in which an invitation to a campus speaker should be withdrawn? Under what circumstances, if so, and is there anyone who is out of bounds?
I think it's nice to think about these different areas where these questions come up, because invitations are one set of free speech issues. I think it's easy to lump things together and maybe sometimes helpful to split them apart. So when you say invitations, invitations can come from different people. They can come from student organizations, or they can come from a university as a whole. And I think there's a tendency to sort of attribute the same level of responsibility or obligation to the university, no matter who it is who's done the asking, right? Whether it's one individual student or a student group or the university as a whole. And I think we might think about how much these different things imply endorsement by the university, because I think some of them imply more endorsement than others, and also what types of values might be served in letting some invitations go forward. So a concern I have with student groups is, quite frankly, a lot of the most controversial speakers have come from, and the most sort of contested and high-profile speech situations that we've all seen on the news have come from student invitations to campuses. And I see so many sides to that. I see students thinking to other students, how dare you bring this person to campus when one of their main messages denigrates me and my ability to be here, denigrates my equal dignity and status. I'm painting with a broad brush here, obviously. This isn't what's at stake in every single one of these debates. I see students saying, we have freedom of association rights the same as every other student group. The university shouldn't interfere in who we get to invite to come to campus. And when I step back from it, I see students who are all trying to learn. I see students who maybe have made some stupid invitations and who learn partly by doing that. And as an administrator, I think there's some value in that process. At the same time, it can be enormously expensive and cause enormous strife and enormous senses of sort of violation of well-being for some of the people on campus. So I think they're really complex issues, and there are lots of different values to talk about in relationship with them. And that plugs into this question of, what is a university's responsibility? What is it that universities are supposed to be fostering? Which is just a really big question. But one thing I was thinking of, Jelani, when you mentioned about the phrenologists and everything, it's completely right that within the academy, within the structure of the hierarchy of the academy, there are some ideas that are better than other ideas. And it's absolutely true as a matter of moral and political truth that all people are created equal. So sometimes, one reason we sometimes want to protect free speech is maybe we've gotten it wrong. And that's not an argument that I think we really need to worry about in these areas. And yet, I think if a student group wanted to be the Flat Earth Society, or some flat earthers wanted to come and talk at the university, people would say, let them talk. We're not going to tenure them. We're not going to hire them. We're not going to tenure them. But, just let them talk, and we'd say there's got to be some space for that.
Well, I mean, climate denial is, I think, a very real-world example where it's, a set of ideas that, 99% of credible scientists will say, have no place even being debated any longer, and yet we know, they are debated. In fact, they're credited at the highest levels of our government now. Would those, under your prescription, Jelani, would those ideas be banned?
Seems like part of your point is that they're not questioning somebody's right to exist or threatening their very well-being.
Right, I was going to say. So there's a really big difference between the relatively innocuous flat Earth idea, unless this person is an aerospace engineer who's going to be designing your airplane.
Right. Yes.
They probably will come and go without much difficulty in your life. And for the climate deniers, that is more politically fraught. But it also doesn't relate to the very distinct history that people of color have in this society of being excluded from these institutions. So what universities are doing is, on the one hand, saying, generally speaking, we have a history of excluding you and your kind. We are attempting to have new, diverse institutions. Please come be part of this community. And when you get here, we can discuss your inherent inferiority. And we'll have a just kind, civil conversation. You'll still be part of the community, but we'll talk about these things, and we'll see how that works.
As long as it's civil.
As long as it's civil. But now allow me to contradict what appear to be contradictory. You're going to say, you'll be shocked by this, Suzanne, but I actually agree with you. I think that when invitations are extended, disinvitations should be few and far between. They should be rare, and there should be a high bar for doing so. Only in instances in which there is a credible possibility of danger. I think that the bar was easily met when people were looking at the materials and the online conversations about what was supposed to happen here in August under the guise of free speech. And many people had criticisms of the ACLU around this because they were screaming free speech, and there was another conversation saying, no, these people are not here for speech. They're using speech as a kind of stalking horse for a completely different agenda that ultimately culminated in the loss of Heather Hayer's life, which was entirely predictable. And so in that instance, I think something like that is warranted. When Milo Yiannopoulos said that he was going to give the citizenship status of students at the University of California, I think that is actually dangerous. It would be akin to giving out the personal information of female students on campus and saying this is where the homecoming queen lives, and this is her address and her phone number and all these other kinds of things. I think that those are circumstances that are different. So having talked about these layers of hypocrisy implicit in this conversation, I think that the wisest course of action for students, particularly students of color who find themselves in this position, is to challenge and to refute and to debate and to argue to the extent possible. Because what happens when you disinvite people is that invariably those people speak in other places, and they do so with the mantle of martyrdom. They do so being able to say that we've been prevented, and it's not, as in with the flat earth people, they'll say, they won't even debate us on this issue. And sometimes you don't debate people because you are nuts, right? You don't warrant a debate. But when you stop them from speaking, they're saying, see, they must know, we're telling the truth. They don't want you to hear what we have to say.
So So no disinvitations, but Alexis, what do you think about this from the student perspective? Should student groups have limitations on who they can invite to speak on campus?
Well, I agree with what's been said. I think that if there is a credible threat to students, if what they're saying is attacking other groups, attacking people, then no, they shouldn't be invited to campus. But, you know, if they have views that they want to debate that aren't harmful to groups, I think is the distinction. Or if by them coming to campus, are they going to harm the people here? And if not, then I think they should be allowed to come speak.
So safety is a critical rule in making those decisions. There's a new proposed policy on time, place, and manner on campus. And Leslie, can you talk a little bit about that new policy as proposed and what it would mean for campus?
Yeah, sure. So this is a policy that would be geared toward speech by people not affiliated with the university and not related to university events. So when the university has events where people, members of the public, are invited, something like this, there's a right to counter speech to that, demonstrate, and what have you. This is about people who kind of want to take their message and bring it to the university. And right now, the university doesn't really have any regulations of regarding speech of that kind. And that was part of what was at play on August 11th when an outside group shows up and decides to march on grounds. There wasn't a regulation that said you're not able to do that. So the concern, and this sort of goes back to questions about what universities are about and for. The idea is to try to preserve a lot of the energy and resources of the university towards speech that is connected with the university, and to provide certain spots on campus for anyone who wants to come and speak, but they have to book it in advance, and there are certain time parameters along with that to make sure that people have equal opportunities to use it. It's available during the day when the administrative capacity is here to administer it. And that's the basic idea. So, you know, this is another way in which public institutions are maybe different from public parks or something like that, where a public park, everyone always can come and reserve it and use it, and the question is just, what should the university's orientation be toward speech that's sort of coming from, you know, speech that's sort of not necessarily related to what's happening at the university, and this is an attempt to work on that.
Right, and I know that that proposed policy has been discussed all throughout the institution with a variety of different folks. You know, Alexis raised an important issue earlier about Black Lives Matter group and being pepper sprayed. Would this policy have protected those students from being pepper sprayed, or would there be a different treatment, or how would that work?
I think I probably need more
more information.
So on the night of August 11th, once the white supremacists reached the rotunda, they circled around the Thomas Jefferson statue and the students there.
So we're talking about August 11th?
Yes.
Yeah. So this policy would mean that a group like that could not come to campus for expressive activity on their own terms when they want and be in any place that they want to. So had this policy been in place, those folks would have been in violation of this policy, and to that extent would have been trespassing and could have been asked or required to leave. I think there are other things that happened on August 11th. I don't want to suggest assault, for example. So I'm not saying that a free speech violation was the only possible thing that could have happened, but this policy would say outside speakers need to give prior notice and can be in particular places.
Good. So I think we've reached a point where we can probably open the to audience questions. Anybody who has a question for our panelists can come to one of the two microphones that are in the aisles here on each side and ask a question. Yes, sir.
Incitement. And the issue of incitement is defined, as I understand it, to some extent by the proximity between the speech and the subsequent action, the famous shouting fire in a theater, right? So that really implies that there's a cause and an effect. Can't the concept of incitement be extended in a society where the effects are so obvious that you could make a stronger line between the speech and the acts, even if you can't draw it as a straight line?
I think it's addressed to you, but I'll jump in after you do.
Sure. So, I think it absolutely can. And, the further out you get causally, the more types of questions you'll have and the more line drawing. But there's no doubt that our particular definition of incitement is quite narrow. And it requires that the speech be intended to cause imminent lawlessness or violence and be likely to do so. So there has to be intent, imminence, and likelihood. I think it's probably not an accident that that particular standard was developed during, in a sort of relatively non-threatening context. That it wasn't in the sort of fires of serious pressure that standard came about. And one problem with the standard is, pretty much the horse already has to be out of the barn before you can regulate. So, for example, what happened in Charlottesville on August 12th, very, very difficult to shut down that assembly before it happened on the basis of an incitement standard. And for many, this means the standard is sort of too little, too late. You're getting so close to the powder keg that it's dangerous. I think that's something that we need to think about as a society. And I wanted to come back to the flat Earth thing because part of what I was saying, I think you and I agree with it, is that it's not so much that the speech is false. Both examples of speech are false. It's the danger involved in the one message versus the other message. And the danger relates to this, the danger that an intolerant message breeds more intolerance. And by tolerating that message, the concern is we're actually breeding more intolerance, rather than, as some have argued, we're sort of galvanizing ourselves and creating more tolerance. We worry about this causal link. I think it's a serious thing that we have to grapple with, and it's a cost to the free speech regime we have. That's not to say there aren't hard problems once you open it up, but we do have to, I think you're right there in the hard questions of the type of regime that we have.
Just as a really quick thing, I think that one, I have to say up front, I should have said up front, that I operate in two arenas, academia and journalism, that are dependent upon the protections of the First Amendment. I am not an anti-First Amendment person. What I am being critical of is the idea that we have to have a kind of completely, in one arena, a kind of completely laissez-faire approach to the First Amendment, even though we recognize that there are areas like slander or libel or incitement that are not, protected speech. That said, there's not a one right answer about this, about whether a society that permits illiberal speech becomes consequently it builds up its muscles of liberalism by allowing this to be spoken, or whether that society in turn has turned a blind eye to the possibility that these illiberal ideas will take root and present an actual threat to the idea of liberalism. The reason for that is that human nature is not that simple. And the people who founded this country, their contradictions already duly noted, recognize that there were problems with allocating too much power to government. There were problems with allocating too little power to government. It's the same sort of question of balance. At what point does an illiberal idea pose a threat to liberalism? It's not the simple presence of it. Or even if we're talking like as a biological metaphor, it's not the presence of a pathogen in your bloodstream that immediately says we have to have this immune response. It's the presence of a particular threshold of that pathogen, which then says, oh, well, you know what, we're actually in trouble. We have to muster a response to this. And what I'm saying is that in this instance, I believe that this has met that threshold consistently. And the argument on the other side of it has not been, in my experience, has not taken into account the virulence of these ideas and the impact of them and the way in which they have continued to deform American society, which is why, from a particular vantage point, you could be shocked that someone lost their life in August. Meanwhile, I was sitting back with people I knew going like, somebody's gonna get killed in this situation. And I'm not saying that we were clairvoyant. We didn't have to be. We understood history.
But just to add a little bit on the point about incitement, because sometimes people conflate the idea of incitement with provocation. Incitement is me rallying other people to go out and do an act of violence. It's not me saying something so provocative to you that you punch me in the nose. That's not incitement. I mean, that could be a provocation, but it's not incitement. And so I am, I don't think shouting fire at a crowded theater is, I don't think that's an incitement theory that makes that, speech that's not protected by the First Amendment. I do worry a little bit about broadening the definition of incitement because there's all kinds of speech. One example classically is the burning of a Quran, this very provocative act in Florida that led to murders and deaths and protests all around the world. Was that, it's a very provocative act. And I think the senior-most leaders of our government, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, were absolutely right to discourage that act. But I still don't think it qualifies as incitement. He wasn't urging people to commit acts of violence. In fact, those who committed them were not people who would have listened to him anyway. It was protests that erupted because the act was so upsetting. You could think about somebody at a Trump rally who, speaks out against Trump, and then there's a violent reaction against that person. Is that person guilty of incitement? I'd just be leery of expanding the definition because I think there are all kinds of speech that can elicit a violent reaction, but that still are protected, and that if that starts to become the standard, I worry about the kinds of speech that would be suppressed under that. There are other theories. The Supreme Court has said cross burning is so intimidating that is not protected speech under the First Amendment. Could we extend
that black radical leftist Clarence Thomas made that argument.
So could we extend that for things, the kinds of things that were happening here in Charlottesville that I think had a very similar kind of cast to them, and maybe hadn't occurred in exactly this way before, but the torches. The ACLU went back and revised its policy about the combination of speech and bearing weapons to say, when you have that combination, the speech takes on a different cast. So I think we have to be, creative and really push ourselves about how we, think about extending the different grounds that we have in terms of regulating speech and how they can better address some of the challenges we face now. I think that is necessary, but at the same time, we've also got to be very mindful of the risks. I mean, I think, Jelani, you articulated very well some of the risks of disinviting a speaker. And, do you embolden that person? Do you legitimize them? Do you give them the ability to then say, they won't even debate my ideas, I'm being shut down or shut out. If we accept that kind of theory when it comes to a campus speaker, do we not believe that could operate, about these sets of ideas, and that those ideas could become perhaps even more potent and pernicious, if we passed laws or rules that, made them off limits on campus?
No, I mean, I think that what I'm talking about is pragmatism. Like, the first part, like, my anger came when I spoke idealistically. The pragmatic part was that given that none of this is going to happen, we will never seriously curtail the ability of people to behave or really articulate racist ideas in this country. What is the most pragmatic response for people who are on the other side of it? And that's kind of what my perspective of this is. Now, on the other side, the hand of burning the Quran, context matters here. Now, that should be very clear. I don't agree with the acts of violence that happened in response to this. But in the United States, we have the prerogative to imagine this as a provocation outside of context. But if we're talking to people who are in the Muslim world, this is an extension of the United States toppling the Mossadegh government in Iran in the 1950s. It is an extension of the United States invading Iraq twice. It is an extension of the United States policy in Saudi Arabia. It's an extension of the United States policy in Israel. These are people who are looking, what we saw with Charlie Hebdo, and again, I do not defend the acts of violence that claimed the lives of 12 people in 2015 in Charlie Hebdo, but the blindness that says we're talking simply about freedom of speech, not talking about the marginalized population of Muslims in France and how they interpret satire very differently. If we're talking about satire on an even plane, a kind of horizontal level where we're making fun of peers, that's one thing. But it is very different to be socially subordinate. And what you're calling freedom of speech is actually a reinforcement of that subordination. And people respond to that very differently. And so I think that if we're going to talk about this, we have to at least give the context of how people come to understand that this is not a matter of speech. This is a matter of furthering the absence of recognition of their humanity. And so this is what I mean by saying that the so-called liberal ideals have always, starting with the biographies of the people who profess these ideas, they've always had this relationship to subordination of other human beings. And until we address that, we don't have any hope of understanding why some people don't feel the same way about the vaunted holy qualities of either Jefferson or the First Amendment.
All right, Jelani gets the last word on that exchange, at least until dinner. We have another question in the audience.
I'm just trying to get at the core speciousness of the argument of the white supremacists that this was a matter of free speech, and also some of the points that Dr. Cobb was making about reinforcing, ostensible democracy in service of sort of the hierarchies that have precluded people from being participatory in it. I wonder if there's a distinction to be made, and forgive my complete legal ignorance and nuance, but of it actually being a matter of free speech in the opposite direction, where people's speech is infringed upon by the congregation of white supremacists. For example, when I was there as a counter-protester on August 12th, we certainly felt like our free speech was infringed upon by the violent demonstration, heavily weaponized assembly. And then more broadly speaking, on campuses, students of color, among others, feeling like their free speech is impinged upon by the mere existence of that. Is that a legally, does it exist legally as opposed to these exceptions, incitement, et cetera, that are more specific?
From our perspective as PEN America, a free expression organization, we think a lot about the notion that a truly open environment for ideas and expression cannot exist when some groups are kept out of the conversation for a whole range of reasons, because they're discriminated against, targeted, not present in the room. So our view of free expression is expansive in that way. At the university, there's an obligation to protect people's rights to an equal education. And so when certain kinds of speech make that impossible, then I think the rights that you're talking about of students who are silenced or excluded could be implicated, but it's a pretty high standard. And so what we see in a lot of these cases is it's sort of speech versus speech. I mean, that's what happened in the Charles Murray case at Middlebury, when you had this person associated with a controversial set of ideas that many people thought were racist, coming to campus and then being
no, they
unable.
are racist. Look, Murray is racist. Does not think he's racist. Murray is racist. If you read a book about black people being intellectually inferior, that by any standard, whatever bar we establish, that meets the bar of racism.
Okay, I don't disagree, and let's call it that way. So someone associated with a book that included racist ideas coming to campus and being shouted down and unable to go forward with his speech. The counter-protesters, they have their speech rights too. And that's, I think that's one of the trickiest issues, is when speech is pitted against speech. It's not a question of a state actor. That was a private university. And our position as Penn is, when speech sort of crosses the line to silence and suppress other speech, it's gone too far. And that, what should happen in a case like that is there should be an opportunity for people to make their points, get their point of view across, register their vehement disagreement, but not when it comes to the point of actually silencing the speech. I know there was an incident here, that implicated these issues that happened some weeks ago involving speakers from the Israel Defense Force that came to campus, and I think were not able to go forward with their speech. They're tough calls. At a place like the University of Florida, they had Richard Spencer come to campus, and I think they did a good job of allowing, the university spoke out in its own name, campaigning against Spencer's ideas, making clear that his presence on campus, while something that they couldn't block under the First Amendment, did not reflect any willingness to be associated with the message that he would bring. They had counter-protesters who had a prominent place where they could get their views across. The speech was sparsely attended. And I think the weight of the university came out on the side of rejecting Spencer's ideas, but he wasn't silenced and he wasn't shouted down. I think, where possible, that is the better outcome.
So I think the question is intriguing in the sense of, the idea, it seems to be that by the manner of speech of the white supremacists who came on campus on August 11th, were they suppressing somebody else's speech? Leslie, what's your thought about that?
So I think there are a lot of different aspects to your question, and I don't know that I can cover all of them. But on one level, there are lots of different ways in which speech can be regulated to try to address some of the concerns. And I want to talk specifically about August 11th and then talk more generally. So, I think the thing about August 11th is it's such a mistake to think about this in free speech terms. And society kind of does it, but I think we at the university know better than that. What happened was a group of protesters or demonstrators, whatever you want to call them, I want to recognize there was an expressive aspect to what they're doing, but they surrounded a group of students and others and threw torches and prevented them from leaving for a certain amount of time. There's assault wrapped up in that, there's false imprisonment wrapped up in that, there's battery wrapped up in that. There are a variety of different either crimes or torts that were committed there that don't have anything to do with free speech. And the fact that there was some expressive component to what they were doing does not in any way immunize any of the rest of that conduct. So I want to be clear about that, because I think one way in which free speech rhetoric gets misused is to attempt to immunize other types of conduct that are illegal. And this is one instance where I worry that our rhetoric has that unfortunate risk. So there was plenty that was wrong about what happened. Now, there are also free speech rules that could come into play here. So protesters generally don't have a right to get right up in your face. You know, cities and municipalities and universities routinely regulate how much space there is between protesters and counter-protesters out of safety concerns. That's not a First Amendment problem. That doesn't infringe some right you have to be right up in someone's face. The Second Amendment issue here is a really glaring one, because the type of silencing that you're talking about certainly occurs when one side is armed and the other side isn't. And that is part of what, you know, I guess the ACLU of Virginia had to sort of grasp in seeing it happen. But I think a lot of people would have said, yeah, that's carrying a gun while protesting is a totally different thing from protesting. So there are areas, and those are sort of legal aspects to your question, where there's nothing about the First Amendment that says that you have to be able to carry while you talk. There's nothing about the First Amendment that says you have to be in someone's face. The city of Charlottesville tried to say, this particular park is a dangerous one to secure, we'd like to move to another place. Often those types of decisions would be routine and would pass muster, but in this particular instance it didn't. So there are a lot of kind of time, place, manner regulations that can attempt to address some of this. But underneath all of this, there's the fact that the First Amendment doesn't do a great job of dealing with the idea of silencing. That the idea that someone's talk silences someone else's talk is not something that the First Amendment grapples with very well. It also doesn't grapple very well with the fact that speech opportunities are determined by economic resources. And not everyone has equal economic resources. That is a fact that our First Amendment jurisprudence has not dealt with very well. Back in the day when the ACLU started, partly it started to try to promote labor interests, to try to support rights of protest by workers. Ultimately, that civil liberties route sort of split off from the economic inequality route. So there are lots of things that it doesn't grapple with very well that I think are also in your question.
And just as a quick point to what you were saying about economics, which is one of the real interesting arguments happening now around the First Amendment, which is that the cost of these kinds of events for security, universities are liable for the security costs of these kinds of events. And there are literally circumstances in which one speaker comes, blows out the budget for the school, and they are then liable if a school wants to, if students want to bring another controversial speaker. And so there's this question of how much financial cost is a school responsible for, an institution responsible for, in providing a forum for controversial speech, because you know, speech may be infinite, but resources are definitely finite, and they haven't figured out how to nuance that.
We have one more question, yeah.
Thank you for this event. At my alma mater, in a couple weeks, Dick Cheney will be speaking to the Young Republicans Club, and he was invited by them, and of course there are going to be high security costs because it's Dick Cheney. But with regard to what you said about security costs, does that necessarily have to be in proportion to how volatile an event with such a speaker might be? Because, you know, if you go to a campus like UC Berkeley, a typical Republican like Ben Shapiro still requires $600,000 worth of security. Now, I personally don't like Ben Shapiro, but I don't think that he necessarily requires such security measures in order to keep an event like his speech safe. I don't think he's analogous to Richard Spencer, but there are some people on the far left part of the political spectrum. I consider myself on the left, but at the same time, I don't think that everyone on the right, particularly a conservative, is analogous to Richard Spencer or white supremacists. So how do you navigate that when we're talking about just typical opinions that people might have, not anything particularly extreme or what some average person would call extreme?
Was that to me?
Well, that was to you, but everyone in the panel can answer.
This is a quick response. I think that on the other side, to be critical, like I'm not completely in the tank for the left. I think that one of the problems that has happened is that there's been a conflation of everything with violence. And so it's been really interesting to see where people say, oh, his speech did violence to me. Not really, not necessarily. And in instances in which someone is just saying something that you don't want to hear. And so that is something that's happening within campus culture. Universities, however, have a very different approach to this because they are getting killed with liability things, left and right, on a whole host of issues, especially even around Title IX stuff now, where I read that was the largest source of legal settlements for universities in the previous year. And so they are skittish, and they're erring on the side of caution because anything that happens can affect their bottom line and expose them to legal liability, especially in a place like Berkeley or in state schools, which have another kind of part of this, which is implicit within their skittishness, which is the withdrawal of funds from state legislatures. And so, as one of my colleagues put it very well, he said, we are the university in California, not the University of California, because they get such a small portion of their funds from the state now. And so they are justifiably mindful of anything that may cause them to have to dip into that pot that's already diminished.
Anybody else?
It's a real issue. The cost issue is a real issue. And I think you put your finger on, not everything has to be super expensive, but universities have to plan for the worst in some of these situations. I think it's a sort of sad reality that if everyone just sort of stayed in their lane and said, well, I'm not going to let that bother me, and I'm going to do my thing over here, things wouldn't cost that much. But people have moral convictions, and people have a sense of outrage, and they have their own right to speak. And from a security standpoint, there's some volatility that comes along with that. And that's not knocking anybody, right? It's just saying there's some volatility that comes along with these types of contentious interactions. Universities definitely have to plan for the worst case scenario, and that's going to mean putting security money toward an event, even if the worst case scenario doesn't materialize. You can't call back all those overtime hours after the fact. So it's a real source of cost, and it's just an enormously volatile area for universities and for municipalities, for cities. I've sort of joked around with lawyer friends that there should be an insurance market for this. There should be, sort of disaster insurance for speech events, and Berkeley would be more costly to insure than Iowa City probably, but you could try to spread this cost through some sort of risk pool because it's just an enormous cost.
Wow. Okay. Last question.
Thank you all so much for your time. So my question has to do with breaking down the dichotomy that we find ourselves in and that I've experienced as a student between you're on the side of free speech or you're on the side of diversity and equity. And from what I've seen in city council meetings and from what I've seen in trying to moderate student council meetings, my use of the language of mutual respect and civility seems to connotate or implicate a respect for potentially harmful or identity-based discriminatory language. And so I am interested in what language we can use instead as state actors, as public universities, as cities, that brings with it a sense of respect for all identities, but that also upholds free speech, so that civility and mutual respect are no longer seen as disregarding identity?
What a great question, and good one to end on as well, because that's really the crux of a lot of the issue here, is that diversity and inclusion are placed in contrast with free speech. How does that work? What do we do about that?
When you're talking about raising questions about language, I think that, can be somewhat situation specific. Certain terms take on connotations, and they may have them, one person thinks the idea of, a vulnerable community, makes perfect sense and is perfectly acceptable. And I've heard other people who absolutely reject that terminology and think it's sort of, it seems it place blame on the community itself rather than on, those who are doing the marginalizing or disempowering this community. So I don't know that I can answer specifically what language would work here, but we talk about trying to make the university truly open to both all people and to all ideas, and that those are, comparably important imperatives that can and must be reconciled. And we try to spell out in our campus principles, some of these issues that we've talked about here, like the distinction, the idea that you want a liberal policy when it comes to who can be invited to campus, for any department or student group to be able to invite who they want, and you want a much higher bar when it comes to disinvitations, because that's a situation where the university is making a viewpoint-specific judgment from on high and imposing it. And it really takes away from this notion of the open campus where all of these entities are empowered to invite and include as they want. The idea of having, if you're going to say Dick Cheney can't come, on what principle? Is there a list of people who are not allowed to be invited, and who decides who would make that list? So, I just encourage you to try to puzzle through this in dialogue and hear from people, why is it that, these terms, connote things that perhaps you didn't intend? How would they put it, explaining in a genuine way, ideally face-to-face, which I think that's part of why we come, is because I think it's tough to do on email and even worse on Twitter and in the op-ed pages. It's so easy to be misconstrued. Things are taken out of context. But I do think if you put people down face-to-face very often, there's a lot, even though we disagree, there's a lot we agree on, and try to build on those areas in order to come up with solutions.
Any other final thoughts?
I think that there used to be a thing called community standards, and that was what stood between free speech and diversity and inclusion, and saying that you have the right to say, these things, but why would you want to? And I think, or why would you want to act in ways that are contrary to the spirit of community that we're trying to cultivate? But what's happened here is a kind of belligerent selfishness that has made it difficult for that idea of community standards to stand in the breach. And what I mean by that is this: it's a kind of curious question that started popping up when I started doing talks. And then it popped up with such frequency that I actually began to say, wait, actually, this really is a question. But it would be about why white people can't use the word nigger or nigga or whatever derivation of it that you choose. And it would mystify me, because I'd always be like, knowing the history of that word, why would you want to? What do you feel like is being taken away from you if people discourage you from using that term? Or if African Americans use it, and very many African Americans have huge issues with it being used even among our own community, but if African Americans use it, given all that that word has done to us, can you just let us have that? Can we just slide on that one thing? But no, this is something that I have to have a conversation about again, again, and again, because I think that there is a conflation of believing that the inability to subordinate other people diminishes your own freedom. And as long as we have that contradiction, it's going to be hard to reconcile those two things.
Right, well, that's going to be the last word for the night.
And Jelani is such a
Thank you all. Thank you. Congratulations. All right. Hope it's not.